We have to do our own attachment work. And in the same way that the patient has the healing from the get-go, so do we. Because sometimes therapists will say, how am I going to do this? And sort of like try to foster, secure attachment when I've never had it myself. And the answer is, yes, we have to do our own work. But the other answer is that we also have the capacity within us as well to really respond in very different ways than just what we've experienced in our worst, most traumatizing interactions.
Welcome to Therapist Uncensored. Building on decades of professional experience, this podcast tackles neurobiology, modern attachment, and more in an honest way that's helpful in healing humans. Your session begins now with Dr. Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott.
Hey, fellow neuro nerds out there, welcome back. We are absolutely thrilled to bring you an in-depth conversation with none other than Diana Fosha today. So, super excited about that. This episode will be one you will return to, guaranteed. So go ahead and download it because she's a rare bird with such incredible experience and practical insights for everyone. First, though, two quick announcements/news. The first is that right after the election, we offered a community Zoom meeting to catch folks who were reeling. And within 24 hours, 350 people had signed up. This coming Friday, November 22nd, 2024 at 3 p.m. Central, we are hosting another free follow-up meeting. Basically, just anyone needing support is welcome to attend. No charge, no catch, nothing commercial. Just a place to land for those that are struggling to process kind of new realities or current realities. Just a place to land for those that are struggling to process this. Go to therapistuncensored.com/events to sign up, and we might see you there. Also, we couldn't be more excited to get to present at the largest psychotherapy conference in the world next March. We will be bringing our deepest clinical exploration of how to use the modern attachment spectrum to the Psychotherapy Networker Conference in Washington, D.C. next March of 2025. But let me tell you, anyone you want to hear from will be there. Check out the lineup. It's basically one-stop shopping for all the very cool leading ideas and thought leaders today. That's the Psychotherapy Networker Conference. Sign up with our link to get the lowest price. Right now, you'll get 40% off. But also, if you use the code SYM, which stands for symposium, SYM50 for $50 off by using pesi.com/TU. That's PESI.com/TU for $50 off your registration. And the earlier you sign up, right now it's 40% off. It'll be a good time. We hope to see you there. Now, speaking of legends and attachment and neuroscience and the relational sciences in general, it is our pleasure to deliver one to you right now. Diana Fosha is the developer of AEDP, which stands for Accelerated Experiential Dynamic Psychotherapy. She also directs and founded the AEDP Institute, which has taught thousands of students across the world. Based in New York City, she has forged a healing-oriented approach that transforms emotional suffering into flourishing through radical relationality and neuroscience-informed practices. A faculty member at major institutions, including NYU, Mount Sinai Medical Centers, and Adelphi University, Fosha's work focuses on healing trauma, repairing attachment wounds, and rekindling vitality through the integration of clinical practice with cutting-edge research. You can see why we would be drawn to her and would absolutely insist that she come on the show. And we are delighted she did. By the way, these intensive accelerated therapies really have my ear right now. And at another time, we're going to share our reactions to the AEDP conference we just attended. So let's jump right in. It is my pleasure and honor to bring you my conversation with Diana Fosha. We are so excited to bring you a pioneer in the field. Welcome, Diana Fosha.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. Look forward to our conversation.
Me too. And, again, this conversation is going to be for everybody as always, but especially if you're a clinician, I want you to grab your popcorn, sit down, join us in this conversation. I just already know that it's going to be great because of the material that we're going to be covering. But to get us started, many folks may not have heard of you. Can you just describe yourself briefly? Or not even briefly, just describe yourself any way you want.
Yeah, I think that's one of those Rorschach questions.
Yeah, it
is. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, I think of it as a bit of a Rorschach question. But when my book came out that sort of started this whole AEDP thing, that was in 2000. In retrospect, I sort of say there was one AEDP practitioner in the world, and that was me. And, in interviews and lovely interviews like this, I've been sort of asked, is this a dream come true? Meaning what's happening in the AEDP community and the people who have gotten to know this way of working. And I said, no, because I didn't dream it. I wrote a book and I had hoped that some people would read it and maybe it would change a few minds about how to approach clinical work. That was the dream. Everything that has sort of come afterwards, whereas it's truly just about worldwide at this point in terms of the practitioners that we have, has been sort of a kind of bottom-up resonance response growth, as opposed to something that we were aiming or I was aiming for all along.
Is there a rough number of practitioners or people that you've trained? Or
I don't know, but what is very striking to me is, that we have like really well-developed communities, not just in North America, but in South America, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Europe, in France, in Scandinavia, in Italy, in South Africa, in the Middle East, in China, in Japan, in Korea. So there's something about that therapists from all of these different cultures are able to sort of make this way of working their home in a way that's congruent with their own culture and be able to do clinical work within it. So that's something that just feels moving and beautiful and shows something that we're sort of tapping into universals and not just sort of culturally contingent ideas.
I love that. And I want to come back to that specifically about that cultural piece because that's so interesting. That's the best case scenario for us is like, right, you have an idea and it just, that's basically what happened with the podcast. But, just somehow, like you're saying, there's some resonance.
Right.
And that's just really, really incredible. So can you say the name of your book and let's, what does AEDP stand for?
In a way like EMDR, we're trying to get away what it stands for and just let AEDP be AEDP. But what it stands for is, and it's a mouthful, accelerated, experiential, dynamic psychotherapy. And the name of the book that came out in 2000 is called The Transforming Power of Affect, a model for accelerated change.
Why do you think it took off?
I think it took off for a couple of reasons. I think one is sort of it tapped into the therapist's love of their patients, to put it in some very sort of kind of simple way, that for all of the sort of theoretical sophistication, people go into this field because there's something just, when somebody says, why'd you go into this field? Because I want to help people. It feels sort of like simple or simplistic, but there is something really fundamental about that motivation. And that I think it's an approach that allows people to sort of like tap into that and also make use, because of the kind of attachment framework, make use of their own experience and their own feelings in working with a patient of course, with boundaries, et cetera, but not in a way that requires that kind of neutrality, which is such a difficult thing to sort of learn because it involves sort of inhibiting one's fundamental and wired in impulses about leaning in and responding to the distress of others with wanting to do something. I trained in a very psychoanalytic way in my graduate school, and we had a professor who sort of used to joke, don't just say something, sit there.
It wasn't Anna Alonso, was it?
No.
Oh, okay.
Somebody else says that too.
She's a very classic teacher, mentor for many, many, many people. And that was something associated with her. But anyway, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. Just that.
I love the concept. Yeah.
So I think that's one. And I think the other is the healing orientation. And there's something about, again, also like not therapeutic optimism as much, but again, some fundamental belief in the possibility of change as opposed to being so overcome and pessimistic about how impossible it is to change psychopathology. I think those kinds of things really found resonance in people.
How did you get there as far as in writing the book? That these are new ideas, there was enough of something different to hook people. So, yeah, how did that happen for you?
I think for all of the deep interest that I had in learning and so on and so forth, psychoanalytic theories or, just different ways of understanding, I think there was always a way in which I resonated with those work or the work of those people, where that belief in whether it's the inner healer or the healing within or the Buddha within, whatever you want to call it, from whatever perspective, that somehow it was more core and more fundamental than whatever kind of problems or difficulties people developed as a result of the traumas or the suffering they had been through. That there was something else, and maybe in a way this is personal, and I don't know how conscious but yes, I think it was, some sense that I was more than just the sum of my problems or of my defenses or of my maladaptive patterns. And those therapists who saw the more were the ones that I could really connect with. So I think that was just very, very important to me. And I think some of it, certainly in retrospect, it's clear. I don't know if you had asked me this in 2001, if I would have said that to you, but maybe.
Why don't we just begin to just look at what are some of the core principles of AEDP?
And I'll tell you that in a second, but I want to add one other aspect of the resonance. So my book came out in the year 2000. And the 90s were the decade of the brain. And it was also like the 80s and the 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, but particularly 80s and 90s, with neuroscience and neurobiology and this incredibly exciting work of Alan Shore and subsequently Dan Siegel, and also like Panksepp and Damasio writing about emotion. There was just all of this excitement in the zeitgeist. However, while the clinical applications were clear, nobody was sort of spelling it out. How do we take this understanding of attachment? How do we take this understanding that we're gaining about how the brain is processing emotion and specifically not just be inspired by it in some fundamental way, but in some nitty-gritty kind of way? What do you do? And I think that was, that bridge was missing. And in a way, AEDP was like the answer to that. I think that was another reason that people sort of like felt I can take this passion that I have about all of this stuff which is happening in the field in terms of how our thinking is being revolutionized, and I can actually have a way of translating it into what I do in my office with my patients and in what I say and what I choose to focus on. So I think that was another one of those sort of like things that people responded to.
Well, such an important task, because that material back then, I was also in that zeitgeist, and out of excitement about all of that, and all of everybody that you mentioned, there was tons of excitement that we ended up starting a organization here in Austin called Austin in Connection. That the whole thing, IN, was for interpersonal neurobiology, and we brought in all of the people that you're mentioning just about to train us. But it was the whole thing. The problem was, what's the applied? Because we could get so geeky and just geek out on all of the stuff, and then you can make mistakes by coming in and telling your clients all about it, and that's not the clinical application of
Exactly.
affective neuroscience.
Yes.
So I can totally see why that was such a kind of a gaping need. Still is, really. So it's part of why you're still relevant and growing. Yeah.
Right. And it's ongoing work. I mean, it's going to take a long time, and it's sort of learning. It's both ways, sort of like what we're learning from psychotherapy and from experiential work that feeds into neuroscience and vice versa. We got a long ways to go till we really understand how the brain and the body and the nervous system really works.
Well, I even think about the public now understanding so much more about neuroscience. And they're in the same thing, like it gets so exciting. And what do I do? And then there's all this idea of optimizing, okay, how can I raise my dopamine? And, sunlight, okay, cold plunge, that'll give me dopamine for hours, which is great and exciting and wonderful. But again, not exactly the clinical application that we'll be talking about today. That is real life
but
application
it is real
of
life,
part of it.
and it is sort of like part of the interest of it, and
it's
how
exciting.
cool that you can do it, even that's different than clinically.
So does it translate into, when I say, what are some of the core principles? Is it more complicated than that, or is it pretty easy to kind of tick off some of the main ideas? I guess what I'm saying is I don't want to oversimplify.
No, I think there are some core things that I can talk about. I think if I were teaching it as a model, then I might name a couple of others. But I think just for people who really don't know anything about it, and for whom, or, know something about it, but for whom this is an introduction, I think there are like really 4 things that are absolutely core. And they're all important, and they're all sort of holographic. But the first, and I'm going to try to speak about them both as like core principles and a little bit just how they sort of like come into the clinical work from the beginning, right? Not to just first do one and then the other. So I think the first is this idea, and some of them have these catchy little phrases, at least nerdy, catchy little phrases, healing from the get-go. The idea that I've started to talk about already, but that it's not like you first have to heal the trauma to be able to get to the healing. That's certainly the path that therapy hopefully will take and accomplish. But that healing from the get-go, the potential to respond to facilitating conditions or to welcoming conditions with healing, with the capacity to heal, with the motivation to change, it's there from the beginning. And that if you invite it, side by side with whatever trauma there is, there's always that capacity to open up in response to a beautiful sunset, or to experience pleasure, even in these small ways, to experience pleasure, to having a vanilla ice cream on a hot summer day, or to respond with somebody's kindness, with being moved and being open. And that one of the ways that we start, and literally from, and you've seen some of my first sessions, it's literally from the first moments of the first interaction, is to look for those little glimmers that somebody may be devastated and traumatized or very depressed, or, they'll come in with whatever they're coming in, that's the source of their suffering. But at the same time, there's that capacity to connect, or there's that capacity to hope, or there's that capacity of, against all odds, if they had lost all hope, it would be rational. Except against all hope, there's this belief in their own healing. And to sort of like resonate with that and work with it explicitly from the beginning is sort of like one of the things that is a core principle and we seek to do, right? We talk about glimmers. One of my colleagues, Carrie Weiser, talks about the fireflies in the dark, which is just a beautiful image for the same idea, just those little glimmers of light.
It's wonderful. My metaphor that came to mind is not beautiful like that, but I was thinking of a potato and how it grows those eyes,
Yes.
no matter where you put it, it is striving for the light, so not as pretty, not as
well, yes, fireflies are prettier than potatoes as a rule, but what a moving thing, right? Exactly. No matter where you
you put it, throw it in the cellar, it's still going to be looking for life. It's a life affirming,
I think that's gorgeous
manifestation.
Actually.
Yeah.
I have a sort of like a photograph that I often use, which is a daisy sort of peeking up through the cracks, but I might just show a potato.
That's great.
With a credit.
Although, again, fireflies would be prettier, but okay. So I love that. I really love that. And it starts so positive and optimistic and hopeful.
Right.
So what would be the next core? I'm not trying to.
No.
We could talk
absolutely.
about this for a long time, but.
Absolutely. So like the second really has to do with a relational or an attachment perspective. And I use relational because attachment is part of it, but there are other ways of relating. So my one sentence about how we understand psychopathology is that which happens as a result of the individual's unwilled and unwanted aloneness in the face of overwhelming emotion. Right? And
can you say that again? Because I remember in the conference that I was listening to you, I wrote that and highlighted it. It was really beautiful.
Right. And I'll say, in part, I say unwilled and unwanted, and I'll say the phrase, because sometimes people say, yeah, but aloneness is wonderful. Yeah, solitude when you want it is fantastic. Or privacy, great. That's not what we're talking about. So what I said is that trauma or psychopathology is that which results from the individual's unwilled and unwanted aloneness in the face of overwhelming emotion. Very simple, one sentence. Long sentence, but one sentence, right? So that then the second core principle is undoing aloneness by whatever clinical means. Some through stance, some through therapeutic stance, some through relational work that we'll be talking about. But this fundamental sort of like reaching out, to the patient and co-creating something where they will feel that whatever we're going to go through, that I need to sort of like go through to heal or to get better, I'll be accompanied. I won't be alone, right? That automatically just, right off the bat, and it's not simple, but right off the bat, again, there's an undoing of aloneness. You don't have to do this by yourself. We'll do it together.
And one of the really beautiful things, the way that has hit me in particular, is that we can be not alone and not know it. and particularly in a therapy setting.
Yeah. Though once people experience it, they'll people resonate with this idea of how alone I feel, even though I have a large family. Or I have, somebody I was working with recently who said, I had these other therapies, and they helped me, but I just realized how alone I felt in them. So there's something about this kind of fundamental principle. And then, we can spend a long time talking about what are some of the ways in which translated into the work. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit later.
Well, there's the being alone with someone, but also I was thinking, I mean, myself included, right? That like sometimes the other person is completely present and ready and available. And I'm doing the thing that looks like therapy and talking and sharing. So a fly on the wall would say that I'm not alone, but that when your muscles and your memory and your cells aren't used to actually having someone attending, that there's a way that the whole thing can transpire and the client can walk out still not being touched by not aloneness, just because of their adaptations, their early adaptations. Well, that's your paper, right? Undoing Aloneness.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I sort of want to put a pin in that and we'll come back to it, because exactly how to deal with the results of those coping strategies, which protect, but also end up being walls to taking in exactly what we want. And how do therapists work with that, right? It's easy. It's not easy, but you can say undoing aloneness. Great. What does that mean?
So okay, so another metaphor then, that and I had forgotten about it. Before we got on, I mentioned that I had seen you many, many, many years ago, and was really moved and touched, and it really stuck in my mind. And I just also saw her recently again, and that's part of what led to the invitation that I'm so grateful that you took me up on. But one of the things that stuck with me from way back then, I don't know if this is going to make sense, just like the potato, but I don't know why I think of it this way, but an air conditioning vent kind of goes one direction. And so I've thought before about like getting the client, like the uptake, the receiving, that part of it is the whole I mean, it's a process, but it's so difficult, but like that it's kind of a North Star, right? Like one of many, but the idea of the uptake or the reception or the receiving as being so, so important. And I don't know why the air conditioned thing came to my mind, but
yeah, I got the potato. But you're right.
Instead of one direction out,
instead
right?
of one direction, it's both, and it needs to
It's
be
the
taken
uptake.
in.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Right. Absolutely. Or else everything, all this beautiful stuff that the therapist is doing is just beautiful stuff that the therapist is doing.
I think you even said empathy isn't potent. Can you pick that up?
Empathy needs to be taken in to be effective, to be potent. That if I'm empathic, but the patient doesn't experience my empathy, it doesn't mean very much. Like I'm a nice person, or I say nice things, or they can notice, but it's only, be it empathy, be it validation, be it love, be it understanding, being, I see you. Those are extraordinary things when they're offered and they're received. If they're not received, they're basically hitting a wall, and it's as if nothing happened. You might as well be neutral, or say things that sort of get to the head, but not to the heart, or to the body, or to the nervous system. So yeah, empathy has to be received for it to matter, to count. Number 2. Okay, number 3. Number 3 is, I think of it, experiential work with everything. The attempt to sort of like drop down from the head, from story, from narrative, from understanding, from cognitions, all important, but at a different phase of the process. But to drop down from all the stuff that we sort of repeat over and over, and to drop down into experience, into the body, and slow down, really slow down and sort of get the body involved. What's the experience of receiving empathy? What does receiving empathy feel like? Or emotion. Again, the person who says with a flat voice, yeah, I was really angry, and because I didn't like this and I did, okay, there's a whole difference between saying I was really angry and really being able to have a visceral experience of anger or of grief. But we also work with, and that's why I say everything, the experience of healing and the experience of empathy and also the experience of change for the better, which is sort of thing number 4. But before we get to thing number 4, is that that's how we sort of do the trauma processing, that with accompaniment, just this attempt to help the person really, this time with support and not alone, experience something that didn't have a chance to go to completion, that didn't have a chance to go to somewhere adaptive. Because if we let ourselves feel grief, the wave of grief naturally takes you to its completion. We might have to do it many, 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 many times, but nature, sort of like Mother Nature, wired these things into us. And we're trying to sort of like get out of our stories and help people not feel overwhelmed by the emotions of what they've experienced that have been so big, so that if we can do it together, we can process it and we can take it to a place where it goes to a decent place, because the trauma happened a long time ago, even though, or sometime in the past, even though it feels like it's happening all over. So, but the importance of doing it experientially is really the third principle.
I'm thinking about Bruce Eckert's, I forget what it's called, but it's
Memory
the
reconsolidation.
that there's something about again, this isn't what you're doing, but it's just another, like the whole idea behind that. And a gist is that you're activated, you're feeling it, but you're also connected at the same time. And it doesn't work either direction. It doesn't work with one or the other, but it has to have both. So I'm just thinking about the neuroscience behind this beautiful model that you're talking about.
So one of our new sponsors that we are excited about is Peak Tea. We are happy to be talking about Nandeka. It's the pinnacle of coffee alternatives, which are actually powered by mushrooms. Now, I really want my mental focus and my clarity to be high. Besides exercise, I really often find myself a little over-relying on tea and caffeine fixes to keep me going and keep me pumped up. Not always do the greatest effect, especially in the afternoons. But since I've replaced my morning tea fix with Peak's Nandeka, I really feel like it's such a great and healthier alternative. It's a slow release caffeine from probiotic fermented teas and mushrooms. And since I've been drinking it, it gives me much more sustained energy throughout the day. And it even, by the way, activates my metabolism. And it's delicious. Instead of my kind of boring tea bags that I brew in the morning, it's really like a creamy, indulgent, spiced hot chocolate. It's smooth. And I'm actually not a coffee drinker, even though it's a coffee alternative. It is a wonderful caffeine alternative. And I have had friends try it when they're trying to kind of lower their coffee intake, and they really love the flavor too. And I noticed that I don't get caffeine jitters or that afternoon slump, and I love that. So Peaks Nandeca provides sustainable all-day energy. It makes you feel like you're doing something good for your body. So try Peak. Get up to 20% off plus a free rechargeable frother and glass beaker when you purchase exclusively at peaklife.com. PIQUELIFE.com/TU. So you let them know that you discovered them on our podcast. That would be great support. Hey, let's take a break and thank our sponsor, OneSkin. I continue to use OneSkin regularly on my face and body. I love having them as a sponsor. As I mentioned before, they make my life easier. And especially because my skin feels so much more healthy. All I have to do is cleanse and then apply OneSkin to my face and my neck and my body a couple of times a day. And I can see and feel the impact almost immediately, especially on my face. It just feels more nourished, looks more healthy. And another thing that I love about OneSkin is that it's founded by the all women team of scientists that has been very data focused. They use cutting edge science for optimizing skin biology, improving skin health markers. I like the confidence that it gives me that it's science backed. So give it a try. I think you will really love it. Get started today with 15% off using code TU at oneskin.co. That's 15% off oneskin.co with the code TU. After you purchase, they'll ask where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them TU sent you.
And Bruce Ecker's memory reconsolidation, I mean, that's a mechanism that he describes. It also is, he's developed his own therapeutic model. But in his book, AEDP is one of the examples of, an approach that uses the memory reconsolidation mechanisms, right? Because you're going for this transformation. You're sort of like touching on the trauma, but it's going to come out correctively this time as a result of what we do together, right? So they sort of superimposed.
I love the word accompanying too.
Yes.
If you're accompanied.
That already undoes the aloneness. And then we set this whole transformational process into motion. So the fourth core principle, and I would say sort of like one of the things that like AEDP has really sort of like put out there in the map, is something we call metatherapeutic processing, or metaprocessing for short, which is that we're going to process the experience of what's healing or what's therapeutic about therapy. So, going to this example of grief and to a place where somebody who's experienced the loss starts to come to a place where the acceptance is starting to kick in, or the sense of re-embracing life or their own vitality, believing, okay, so there's something after this loss, rather than considering that to be the ending and a very lovely therapeutic accomplishment in and of itself. For us, that's sort of like the end of Act 2 and the beginning of Act 3, right? If Act 1 is dropping down into the experience, Act 2 in this case, it's like working with the grief. Act 3 is what we call metatherapeutic processing, which is that the patient has had a therapeutic experience, a change for the better, and we're now going to explore the experience of change for the better. So, what is it like for you to have come in so depressed or so tense or so fill in the blank? And as a result of what we've done together, to find yourself here with an exhale and an acceptance. What's that like? What does it feel in your body? What's it like that you and I did that together? How does it make you feel about you that you've had the courage to do this? And what we've discovered, and this is a genuine discovery, is that the affects or the emotions that come up in the metatherapeutic processing themselves are transformational. And then we focus on it again. So let's say the person says, I feel relieved, or I feel peaceful, or I feel grateful that we're able to do this together. Well, what does grateful feel like? Or what does peaceful feel like? And usually there's this kind of spiraling process, and one leads to another, so that the whole process of transformation is really expanded and deepened and becomes sort of wired in a much more comprehensive and sort of multimodal kind of way than to merely have it happen once. I had this experience, and that's in one of the chapters of this book in 2000. I had this experience. I was working with this woman who was quite depressed and had some suicidality and had felt very isolated, had felt very rejected by family on religious grounds and her sexual orientation, and was finding herself in quite a desperate place. So we do this piece of work where she actually wants to show me, right? She sort of, we were working with images, and she's talking about this dark cave where she goes. And she says, Diana, I want to show it to you. Come. So she's beckoning, and we go together and we do this thing, which was this very moving and profound thing. So we get to the other side of it. We're sort of towards the end of the session, and she's starting to talk again about how alone she feels. And I basically say to her, wait a second. We've just been through. What about you've beckoned me? You've shown me. You've told me that nobody else wants to accompany you. And that, what's it like? Right? Anyway, so we did that. But it was just one of those moments when it was so obvious that the experience doesn't translate into the representation. We had this incredible relational experience, very intimate, very profound, which moved her. But then when she goes into this other neural network, I'm all alone. And somehow being able to feel it and talk about it and process it, it gives so many other different opportunities of starting to change this representation that I'm all alone in the world. And the metatherapeutic processing is just such a huge part of that.
Then that's kind of what I was referring to earlier about being alone, but not alone, but like the reception, not able to take it in. So I love that. And I could totally also imagine, but I can also see that what is that like with us together now? How is that for you to need me or want me, just kind of lingering. You like to linger, right? Lingering on some of those things being very difficult. And I'm imagining, again, people with different attachment or, leanings, we think of it as leanings, that could be scarier than the trauma that they just talked about.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Like you did a good job, Diana. Can't you just be happy that you
exactly.
Like why are you wanting all this credit?
Right. And that's the other thing. I think that's actually more a resistance of therapists than it is. I don't think that anybody has ever said that to me.
Really?
I don't think so. Well, maybe one person. But I think it's much more like, what are you talking about? Or it's fine. Or more like, okay, we did that. Let's move on. But therapists are afraid. Therapists who are learning, there's this fear that by asking, what's your experience of me, which is part of the relational work, or what's it like that you and I did this together, which is part of this meta processing, it feels narcissistic, like you're drawing attention. It's a long way from neutrality. And it's a little hard to grasp until you do, which is that's what it means to do attachment work, that you're working with the internal working model. And you're not basically saying, tell me how great I am, but you're really asking about the other person's experience of the relationship. It's still inside of their own psyche and still inside of their own experience. I'm not really asking, tell me about me. I'm asking, tell me about your experience of me, or your experience of being helped, or your experience of being cared for, or what's it like for you when I tell you, that I care about you or I want to accompany you, right? And that's how we transform the internal working model, because it's internal. That's the whole point. It's internal, right? The relationship is internal. So very different than narcissism.
Well, it's very, very, very powerful, for sure. Would you want to say a little bit more about how this is different than traditional therapies, including like somatic therapy, all the body-oriented therapies?
Yes. I think particularly in the trauma world, in processing trauma, or people who have had complex PTSD, which involves both big T trauma, but almost invariably relational or attachment trauma, which is often sort of like at the heart of where the deepest hurt is, the kind of betrayal by people, who are hurting you instead of loving you, or people who are supposed to love you, but instead hurt you or betray you. I don't know if I said it right the first
Yeah, I
time,
think you did,
but
it
that's
was
what I
worth
meant.
emphasizing. Yes.
I think it has made therapists very wary of entering into that world. And I think that trauma therapists have tended to be, and again, I don't want to make huge generalizations because there are always exceptions, but have tended to be sort of more like empathic and validating, but really staying out of the way. The most extreme being in sort of like classic EMDR. You're supposed to do the processing, eye movement reprocessing, and the therapists stay out of the way. Don't interfere with a person's information processing, their own natural, and so on and so forth, their own natural ways in which that sort of needs to proceed. And in AEDP, we do that kind of trauma processing, but again, based on this experience of the centrality of undoing aloneness. We work relationally, which is both more satisfying for the therapist, but it's a little bit, well, I was going to say it's a little bit of more of a high wire act. It does make one as a therapist, it makes us as therapists more vulnerable. But I think on the other hand, there's a way of understanding these phenomena in the same way as everything else. And if we stay close, and if we moment to moment track, and if we check with the patient and we check with ourselves, it's possible to do this work without automatically having major ruptures. It's not easy, but it allows us to bring in to the sort of therapeutic center, really the heart of the attachment trauma, which otherwise stays sort of outside, the therapeutic framework. So I think in that way, it's very different, or it's different from the somatic therapies that seek to stay out of the way. And on the other side, in terms of more psychodynamic or psychoanalytic treatments, it's different in two ways. Number one, relational work in psychoanalysis is very interactive, but it tends to be more focused on psychopathology, not invariably, and it's not experiential. So we're working relationally, we're working at the edge of the healing, and we're working experientially with relational experience. And I think the combo of these three things, to my mind, I haven't seen something, again, with a couple of exceptions, that really does the same thing. And the feedback from our therapists is, again, that people feel very alive.
Well, we have to do our own attachment work to do this kind of work.
We have to do our own attachment work. And in the same way that the patients has the healing from the get-go. So do we. Because sometimes therapists will say, how am I going to do this? And sort of like try to foster, secure attachment when I've never had it myself. And the answer is, yes, we have to do our own work. But the other answer is that we also have the capacity within us as well to really respond in very different ways than just what we've experienced in our worst, most traumatizing interaction. So actually that was told to me, I did a presentation, it was at an EFT conference, and somebody raised their hand, and said that. And I thought, that's exactly right.
Well, that's walking the wall. I mean, that's just the theory being absolutely, not where you point. It's not where we point, but where we go. And that if it starts from the get-go, then that's true for us too. I love that response. Now, a couple of things. One is that there's so much to this, and I can't describe, and it's really fleshed out, and there's a lot of detail to it. This isn't just a high wire thing. There's a lot of structure and training, and very careful training that this group offers. So there's more on our show notes page for sure. There's a couple of articles by Diana Fosha directly, and then there's other resources. So one, I want to go ahead and say that there's more, and it's very rich. But also, before we have to stop, unfortunately, because time, I wanted to go back to that societal piece. And can you just speak to ADP and in larger community, and especially today as we're in the middle of all kinds of political unrest
And polarization.
Division.
I mean, I think that I had spoken at the very beginning about how moving it is to me that this work has found resonance with therapists in so many different cultures of the world, that it really just demonstrates that our common humanity. It sort of demonstrates that the place, where all of this strife and polarization takes place, however deep-seated it is historically, it is sort of like at the top of our humanity. And I don't mean that there aren't aggressive and destructive impulses within humans, but it just shows this shared humanity and how we can come together around these things, even in the context of profound suffering and even in the context of ruptures. So I think that's really one of the ways that this work,
that it goes to the universality of some of this, of the biology behind these ruptures. And the other thing that I was thinking, just with a lens of liberation psychology and getting out of the river that we have thought was all that there was, and as we pull out, like you're saying, in all these different communities and cultures, there's so much wisdom. So the focus, if you're really doing it right, you're not applying a therapy. So, it's not just a Western therapy imposed, that there's a lot of room in it to really bring in, and just the kind of cultural practices, because you're following the client so closely.
So closely.
Yeah. And with them so tightly.
Right. Right. No, I think you said it very, very beautifully. And it's also like by virtue of focusing on attunement and moment-to-moment tracking, is a non-authoritarian model. The therapist is not sitting there telling the patient what's what, but there's a process of joint and co-created discovery. And what's going to help one person, what's going to help me working with one person feel safe, is not going to be the same thing that's going to help me work with another person to help them feel safe. What's the same is the aim and the desire to co-create safety. But how we go about it is going to be unique to each individual, but also each dyad, because I'm not the same in each dyad. This dyad and this dyad are really, I'm myself and I'm authentic in both, but we all have so many different facets of ourselves that come out differently in the context of different dyads or different groups.
Yeah, it's built in.
It's built in and it's non-authoritarian. It really is. I want to know you. And it's by knowing you that we're going to discover, what we can do together.
It is so lovely to sit with you and to learn from you and to continue to learn from you. Where can folks that are feeling what I'm feeling learn more and get more?
So first of all, thank you so much. It's been just a lovely conversation and the time has just flown by. So a couple of things. First of all, our website, aedpinstitute.org. One word, aedpinstitute.org. And that's going to be, I think, in your notes. I'll send it along. And on our website, people will find not just our courses and our trainings, but like a ton of resources, a ton of online learning resources, more articles, news, descriptions of the model, all sorts of things. So I think that's one. We do offer a lot of courses, both are sort of more formal courses, which are like really sort of diving deeply into the work, but also some seminars, which are sort of one-offs. And finally, what I'm very excited that we're talking before we started, I'm very, very excited that we are going to have a big hybrid conference in April of 2025 that will be on the website, and I'll send you a flyer. It's called In It Together. I think it's called The Science and Art of Healing in Relationship. I may not have it exactly right because we're still tweaking, but I think that's fundamentally it. Or the science and practice. Oh, I should know my own subtitle, but anyway. But the exciting thing is that we're doing a hybrid conference that's going to be an in-person conference in New York City from April 4th to April 6th, 2025. But it's also going to be an online. So for the people who are not able to come in person, they'll be able to join in the conference online. And so those are really the couple of things that I wanted to mention, separate from papers and courses and this and that and the other thing.
You've been prolific as a writer and as a teacher. And I really encourage people to check these things out, even if you don't do the formal training. For sure, go to the show notes page. You're going to find that at therapistsuncensored.com. And the easiest thing to do is there's a little search button, and you can just put in AEDP or Diana Fosha or really anything that you're interested in, and it'll pull up the podcast related to that. And that's where you'll find all of the show notes. So I really encourage you to do that. You and I both are going to be presenting at the Psychotherapy Networker Conference in March. So that'll be our first time. You're a high flyer. You've been there many times. And again, like I said, that's part of what generated this conversation. So that would be another place that many, many therapists go that I would definitely encourage them to check you out and come see us too. Ann and I would love to see you there. So having listened through, if you're still with us, means that probably you've found good quality content here. That's certainly what we strive to do. And if so, it'd be really helpful to spread the word. And that would be sharing the episode, or a really good thing to do would be totally free, is to just wherever you're listening to this podcast right now, to jump on there and give us a rating and review. That's part of how people find us. And that way we can keep spreading this incredible science, the relational sciences, out to the world to people who don't otherwise access expensive individual therapy. That's what this is about. So help us out there. And in the meantime, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. I think that you're doing something tremendous with your podcast, accomplishing exactly what you set out to do. So I'm very honored to be part of it. So thank you for inviting me.
Therapist Uncensored is Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott. This podcast is edited by Jack Anderson.